Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to June on the Range, a great BookTube event that was started last year by Michael K. Vaughan. He invited a whole bunch of people to be co-hosts, I'm one of them, for an event that every year celebrates Westerns, which a lot of younger readers, a lot of younger viewers will associate with their fathers or grandfathers because that's where they saw them all in a nice collection up in the library that they weren't allowed to enter with their jammed, sticky fingers. But once upon a time, it wasn't just fathers and grandfathers. Once upon a time, westerns were everywhere. Everyone read them. Everyone watched them. They were serials. They were on TV. They were everywhere. They've lost that cultural cachet. I don't quite know exactly why. I imagine it's a whole confluence of events, but for June on the Range, they're back in the saddle, baby. For June on the Range, they are our focus. And I'm an enthusiastic participant of June on the Range. And all year long, while I've been going to the Brattle and other shops and whatnot, I've been slowly accumulating paper westerns. Just these old 30-cent Western novels that you find them. A lot of times over the year they were free. I've just been accumulating them, but not reading them, which is not usually my way. Usually when I accumulate secondhand books, I'm pretty quickly getting to them. But with these, I just stockpiled them, waiting for June on the Range. So I'm reading through a lot of that stuff now, as opposed to switching to the civilized way to read, which is ebooks. So it's forcing me to thumb through pages and have bindings snapped close on me and worry about where I left it or whatnot. All those paper and paste book worries that I so seldom deal with for secondhand reading. But boy, am I glad I did this time around. I'm going through the pile that I have of June on the Range Westerns more or less at random. I'm not following any kind of pattern for June on the Range. And so I'm just taking what comes my way, and that will be disappointments, considering how many hundreds of thousands of Westerns were written over the course of 50 years, maybe millions. I think it's likely to assume that the disappointments should be outnumbering the pleasant surprises by 1,000 to 1. So I really can't fault anyone but myself. I know a lot of good Westerns. I could be rereading them for June on the Range, but no, I'm going exploring. And boy, am I glad I did, because the one I read last night, picked at random, 130 pages, like all of these things are, was fantastic. Just fantastic. This is a 1958 novel called The Day of the Gun. It's by Richard Telfair. I'm pretty sure that Richard Telfair is a pseudonym. He probably had 5 pseudonyms. He probably wrote 600 books. All these Western authors seem to do that. You poke around at them, you find a prairie dog town warren of fake names and millions and millions and millions of books. They must have never stopped writing. They must have just been at their manual typewriters all day long, every day. But this is a Wyoming Jones adventure, and I get the impression from reading this, I mean, you can tell from the cover, that this character must already be known. The designer of the cover must think that the reader already knows this character. And you can tell that from the book as well. The book tells us that Wyoming Jones's life has had 3 stages. It's had 3 big stages. I imagine that the 2 stages before Day of the Gun were also novels. But he is a fairly typical, two-fisted, omnicompetent, tight-lipped, stoic Western hero. He seems cut from fairly familiar cloth in that regard. And I didn't feel at all like I needed to read his previous adventures to understand this one. I thought this was terrific. Just terrific. And it, as you can tell from the title, it tells the story of one day. There's one little town named Serret, Serret, down by the Mexican border in brutally hot territory. Serret is right after you go through a thing that is called in the novel the Dry, this endless stretch of desert chaparral where, as we're told, nothing can live except toads and Comanches. And, the only thing between the Dry and Mexico is Serret, this little town. But I thought it was really interesting that Richard Telfair accentuates the heat. That it's just oven charring, broiling hot all the time here. That it's a recurrent theme in the book. That interested me because, oddly enough, in a lot of Westerns, the only sensory information about the outside world is usually cold, not heat. Which doesn't really jive with my own memories of the American Southwest, but Uh, the the Day of the Gun is the title of the book, is the confluence of events that are pulling into Seret, this unassuming little town, with an old, doddering, pot-bellied sheriff who's just recently fired his deputy sheriff, who was Wyoming Jones. Nothing ever happens in Seret. People just go about their business, and forces are converging on this little town. One of those forces is a group of ex-Confederate soldiers, prisoners of war who've escaped and are headed to Seret because they know that another force converging on the town is a gold shipment, a shipment of Confederate gold, and they want to steal it. They are being shadowed. I think this novel takes place while the U.S. Civil War is still going on, but they're being shadowed by a stereotypical Western sharpshooting gun hero named Glade Perrin, who in any other book he would be the main character. He's the drifter who comes in from out of town. He's the guy who has, a silk shirt. He's the guy who has ivory-handled revolvers. He's the guy who is a bit of a legend, a bit of a gunsmith. He's not. Wyoming Jones is the main character in this book, although I argue that the book gets stolen from both of them by another character. But Glade Perrin is following these men. He's thinking, I can't take them all, but when they go into town, things might fragment, and that might be a nice thing to have that wagon full of Confederate gold. It turns out that the men, the outlaws who are the ex-prisoners who are heading to Seret have ideas in mind. They have ridden hard and fast over the dry, in a place where white men are usually never seen. And they have a plan. Their leader has a plan. Send some men into town quietly at night, ahead of time, to quietly rappel themselves into elevated positions to command the main thoroughfare with gunfire. To command the town, in other words, so that the next morning, the cart that brings in the gold, anyone else who comes in, the law in town, they'll all be under the eyes of unreachable gunmen. It's a pretty good plan. There's another force, of course, on the tail of those ex-Confederate prisoners of war, and that is a Union cavalry detachment with a major in charge who's got a lot of experience, is pretty good with a gun himself. And one other element, also converging on Seret, is the Comanche, the aforementioned Comanche. They have their leader, their chief, is named Sanni, S-A-N-N-I. And one of his braves has noticed a group of white men traveling hard over the dry, when usually white men don't go in there, and usually it's one at a time, and usually the ones who go in die. They die of exposure and thirst. They aren't going anywhere. They don't have any plans. The Comanche are very active in this area. They don't like the fact that the town of Seret is there. They've done their occasional raids. They've done their occasional murders. And when the brave brings the news back to Sanni, we get his thoughts on the matter, and they are chilling. There's one passage in this book where he says, or he thinks to himself, well, there are all kinds of white men. There are individual white men making their fortune. I think he's probably thinking of people like Glade Perrin. There are soldiers. Some of them wear blue. Some of them wear gray. Doesn't really matter to me. And he says there are also just the white people with their squaws and their blonde-headed children who aren't military. And they aren't Texas Rangers. They aren't individual lone gunmen. They aren't anything like that. They aren't usually even armed. They don't look dangerous. But as Sanni points out to himself, they're the ones he fears. They're the real danger. And he's absolutely right. Of course, he's absolutely right. Gunmen come and go. Soldiers are at the behest of their commanders. But westward expansion? That's the tide coming in. That's unstoppable. And that's very different from most of the westerns that I have read for June on the Range. Very different, because that is not offered in any kind of bloodthirsty way. The people, the white people in the area of Seret might think that the Comanche are bloodthirsty, but we see them. Richard Telfair, or whatever his name is, shows us them. He humanizes them, which is pretty amazing. It works really well, and they want to know what these men are doing. And maybe the arrival of these armed men, who are clearly up to no good, in the town of Seret, might distract Seret. Maybe they could take advantage of that to attack the town themselves. And like I mentioned, the Comanche have raided in the area. They have killed white people in the area. And that is a keynote in a character who just takes over this book. There's a little old lady who lives in Sarah. Her name is Mrs. Maggie. We're told that she's weasel-faced and small and shriveled and old, and that she moves with unexpected speed, unexpected self-control. She's just going about her business as another boiling, boiling hot day dawns in Serret, the day of the gun, the day that all the inhabitants who live through it will forever afterwards think of as the day of the gun, when all of the end of the world, in all of its different forms, descends on Serret all at once. She's just going about her normal ways, but this narrative, Richard Telfair, or whatever his name is, he takes us inside the head of all of his characters. All but one, all but Glade Perrin. We don't get much of Glade Perrin's thoughts, but we get a lot of Mrs. Maggie's, and we learn that she lost a lot of loved ones to the Comanche. And instead of making her move, or instead of making her fearful, it has made her Captain Ahab. She is absolutely animated by an all-consuming thirst for vengeance against the Comanche. She doesn't get a chance to do it. It's not like she's going to ride out into the dry herself alone, but she's all consumed with that desire. To the point where when she, early in the book, she sees Sonny and some of his men reconnoitering the town, trying to figure, Sonny wants to go and get my horse. I want to go and see for myself what's going on. He goes to the border of the town himself, and when Mrs. Maggie goes to the town's dilapidated, pot-bellied old sheriff and says, I saw them, and if they're willing to come this close, they might be meaning to make an attack on the town. The sheriff says, you've got Comanche on the brain. Everybody knows this about you. It's all you ever talk about. It's all you ever think about. We can disregard your reports. But she's going to play a key part, because when the day of the gun dawns, the criminals who have reconnoitered the town and who've put men up in high towers, they want another piece of insurance that the town will do what they say. So as the day of the gun is opening, and as Wyoming Jones is commiserating with a friend of his because he's just been fired from his job, he's not deputy sheriff anymore, he's thinking about leaving town, his friend is sorry about that, everyone in town likes him, we're told. But just as that conversation is going on, they hear gunshots in town, down the street, down the thoroughfare. It turns out that the men who have brought their horses into town waiting for this gold shipment have kidnapped 3 women and are holding them hostage to ensure the town's good behavior. And one of those women is Mrs. Maggie. She is in the building that these men commandeer. And she's furious about that. She's not fearful at all. The other 2 women are terrified. She's not fearful at all, but she's nothing she can do about it while they've got their guns on her, while they're extorting the town. As the town quickly comes together to try to figure out what's going on, the sheriff is called out to walk down the thoroughfare towards where they are, towards where these men are holed up, and one of the sharpshooters kills him right there in the street, just falls flat on his face. And they shout out, that is a testament of our intentions. Don't mess with us. We know what we want, just do what we say, and no one else will get killed. Things get more and more fractious as Day of the Gun continues, and as the temperature soars. Telfair never leaves that point alone, that although none of the characters are really talking about it, it's 120 degrees. And that is always present in this story, that the Day of the Gun is going to be murderously hot without a single hint of rain in the last year. And as things heat up, no pun intended, and get more fractious, the men who are holding hostages decide that they need to show another estimate of how earnest they are. And in the meta vocabulary of the Western novel, them shooting to death a complacent, stupid, pot-bellied old sheriff isn't going to cut it with the reader. I'm not even talking about the characters. The reader is going to see that and say, well, he got plugged sooner or later anyway. It's the ageism of the Westerns. The reader isn't going to care about that. In order for these bad guys to really deserve what's coming to them, they have to do something really loathsome. And they do. As a sign of their earnestness, they tell one of the 3 women hostages to strip naked. They strip her naked. And they tell her to walk out into the thoroughfare in the burning light of midday with her husband watching. And as she's walking down the thoroughfare naked, they shoot her to death. Her body just erupts. You can see the cinematic flair of it if somebody ever had the nerve to film such a scene. It's incredibly visceral. Her husband rushes out. Gunfire be damned. His husband rushes out to grab her body and to mourn over it. And that's when Wyoming Jones and Glade Perrin is in town by now, and he is lending a hand. He is a crack shot, an unbelievably good gunsmith. And he is lending a hand to the town. He wants to beat these guys as much as anybody. It's just they seem to have an unbeatable advantage. They've got men up on roofs. Now, Glade Perrin and Wyoming Jones can handle that. That's kind of standard Western hero action fare. But they've also got their hostages. Unfortunately for the men holding the hostages, one of them is Mrs. Maggie, who concocts a plan with the young woman who is the other hostage. She says, what we're going to do, I want you to strip naked and throw yourself at the leader of these gunmen. Throw yourself on his mercy. And I will chase after you, yelling at you, scolding you not to give in to these monsters and also to put some clothes on. And in the scuffle, I guarantee you, one of them will knock me aside. They don't care about me. It's an old woman. And when they knock me aside, I'll make sure to land on one of their guns. All I need is a gun in my hand, and I can help. And that's her plan. And again, like I say every single time, I don't know that there's any chance you're going to come across a paperback of Day of the Gun. This was 25 cents back in 1958, and all I could think when I was done with this is what a bargain that would have been. What a bargain. Just take a quarter and get a book like this. I read it in an hour. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. You know all sorts of things about the Day of the Gun. You know all sorts of things about it as a reader of Westerns, or even I would argue a reader of action plots just in general. You know, for instance, that there's going to be a confrontation here. And it's not necessarily going to be between Wyoming Jones and these bad guys. Typically speaking, Lonesome Dove notwithstanding, Westerns only have room for one hero. You can sense pretty early on in this book, it's not a long thing, but you can sense pretty early on that Wyoming Jones is going to have a confrontation with Glade Perrin, who we've been distracted by the fact because he's been helping the town, but we've been given no indication that he doesn't still want that gold. We've been given no indication of that at all. And you know that there might be a confrontation with the Comanche. At one point, when Mrs. Maggie is talking to Wyoming Jones about the possibility of a Comanche attack on the town, never mind these guys with their plans, and also never mind that horse-drawn cart of gold. The Comanche might be going to attack this town with flame arrows to set the whole town on fire, coming out of the morning's rising sun so that you can't even see them. She knows their tactics, and when Wyoming Jones is thinking, oh, do you think that's really likely? She just hauls off and calls him a dumb jackass. I can't remember the last time I read a Western novel where a feisty old lady called the hero a dumb jackass and didn't die because of it. Not because he kills her, but because the plot is going to kill her. She's the handiest person in this book. And she has no patience for anybody, especially if they're coming between her and her vengeance on the Comanche. It's pretty easy to spot, and also downright eerie, that even when she's fighting against those outlaws who are holding herself hostage, she's only thinking of them as people who are in the way of her vengeance on the Comanche. She thinks that she's going to get what she has dreamed about for years. She thinks the Comanche are actually fixing to attack the town. She can't go out and attack them, but if they attack the town, she can kill some of them. And we're told early on in the book that she actually does sometimes venture out into the dry, hide in the brush, and pick off lone Comanche with her rifle. She's no one to mess around with. And I want to read you just a bit of the prose so that you get an idea of what I'm talking about here, what the prose is like. I'll read you just a chunk of this. I don't think this is still in copyright by anybody, but we'll give it a try. This is at 4 o'clock, the sun began to drop. At 4:30, the hellish yellow thin thing was sinking fast into the west, and broiling waves of heat wafted up from the flats. Still no pressing attack came from the Comanche. Still no flaming fire-tipped shafts sang their whine of death to break the late afternoon silence. Then came the call of a coyote that everyone knew was fake because it was too early in the day for that. They waited in unbelievable heat, forcing themselves to watch the oven-like flats. They sat still, for any movement was an invitation for a sudden spell of dizziness. The visions of a dozen of them danced crazily. The breath of 36 came in short, hard, gassy burbles that made some of them sound like a boy kicking through dry wash bed of dead leaves. Still they waited. Still nothing moved except the flutter of the first buzzard. Still no attack. Not an arrow arched high and landed with a commanding thunk. The great and furious fight that was sure to come had not yet heard the first war cry or resounding rebel yell, both sounds of courage and revenge. Hate on both sides, a deeply wolf-like thing that ravaged the breast of Indian and white alike. A great huge land in readiness for battle. A great huge land ready to soak up the blood of the weak and the strong, the brave and the true, the cowardly and the faint at heart. In readiness and confident. A white settlement of bustling hardcore of determination to resist, a thing to be moved only by greatest force. The Indian, a lashing savage, swift destroyer, but you've already told us they're not. You've already shown us they're not. This is typical Western prose, but you've already shown us that's not true. Their worries about what the white people are going to do are absolutely justified. The Indian, a lashing savage, swift destroyer, now poised like the string of a bow, taut, ready for a run straight at the enemy. And all of it, Indian, white, man and beast, great land and violent sun, together, as silent as the cool, cool tomb. Now, you will recognize right away that is fairly purple prose. That is fairly, you don't care because this book just sweeps you along. But at least that has a quality that I have mentioned a few times in my June on the Range readings this year so far, which is conviction. At least Richard Telfair isn't sneering at this genre, nor is he going through the motions. If he were going through the motions, this would be by the numbers. You would know what was going on. I would say that the final scenes, the final confrontation in the book, and also the final peaceful scene in the town, I would argue that both of those scenes are intensely predictable, but a lot of this book is not. So for a tiny little thing, 130 pages, I think I got this for free, or maybe $1. It was well worth it. So a wonderful boost in the arm to my June on the Range. I am once again going to continue just randomly. I'm going to continue to whittle down that stack of paperbacks until it's either way down or gone before I move on to ebooks. I've got a ton of ebooks I can read, but I'm going to read these things first, and I'm more encouraged than ever. If I can encounter a gem like this, boy, oh boy, if I can encounter a gem like this just at random, it might happen again. So I'm going to give it a try, and I will report back. Thank you, BookTube.